Hello everybody, John Parker here again, Technical Director at the Arboricultural Association. As ever, I hope you're staying safe and well. Welcome back here for the second in our series of Tree of the Best 2. You can see where this is heading. I thought I'd bring you outside today to enjoy this beautiful sunshine in Gloucestershire, safely maintaining social distancing by standing in the middle of this field. Hopefully some of you enjoyed the last Tree of the Best. We had just over 300 views on YouTube, so I'm hoping that's 300 of you who've watched the whole thing and really enjoyed it, and not 300 people who clicked on it, saw my face, thought not this idiot again, and then switched it off. Because it's not about me, it's about our fantastic presenters, and we've got another 3 brilliant presenters for you today. There is a bit of a theme to this one. Today's theme is canopy cover, so all of these presentations are taken from the 2019 Arboricultural Association Amenity Conference. We've got Cecil, Annabel, Buckland and Paul Barber, each bringing their perspectives of canopy cover to the table, and I'm hoping you'll enjoy this little collection. So first of all, Cecil giving what could be a slightly controversial perspective on urban tree canopy cover targets. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, Tony, for that wonderful introduction. And I do want to echo John Parker's words. As an urban forestry traveler, I spend maybe 1/3 of the year on the road. I have to say that this conference is one of the best. So it's always wonderful when I get asked to come here. It's a while ago now, so I guess I did something wrong last time, but no, I'm just kidding. It's really wonderful to be back and to meet many of the good colleagues here. And I'm a bit further away these days. I'm on the other side of on the ocean and the other side of the continent in Vancouver, but I still keep a close eye on what's happening here. And we do live, and I'm not going to be very political here, but we live in very volatile times. So everything seems to be in flux. And I think that's one reason why canopy targets are becoming popular, because people want to have something to hold on to. And I think that is in one way good. In other ways, we may also have to be a little bit careful with that. So I will give you a critical perspective on canopy targets. I'm not going to say they're bad, but I'm just going to say that we have to be a little bit more nuanced probably in how we use them. So I'll start with a few case studies of how cities in Canada, in China, and actually in Australia have been using canopy targets to their advantage, but also sometimes maybe leading to some challenges. And from there on, I will draw upon some pros, some good things about canopy targets, as well as some things that we have to be very careful with, some pitfalls. And then I'll hopefully be able to draw a few lessons of how we can move forward with canopy targets. Because as I said, I think they do have a role to play, but we have to be a little bit more careful in how we implement them. And I know, being in Britain, one of the things you like, apart from karaoke, is trivia. So I wonder if you have been thinking about where the word canopy comes from. Any guesses? Just think for yourself what you think. So it's actually coming from an old French word called canapé. And canapé meant bed curtain. So, which is pretty interesting, I think, because bed curtain gives me that kind of feeling of some kind of seclusion, something safe, something hanging over you, so you're not exposed to this big world around you. And if you look even further back, conopeum, Latin, means mosquito net. So it's pretty interesting, of course, if you think that now today, of course, we look at canopy from this tree perspective, but this is our perspective on what canopy is. And we heard already earlier in the introductions that canopy, for many people, is something very positive, but for other people can also be something very negative. For example, shading. If you go to Finland in winter, you don't want to have too much shade, for example, because the sun doesn't get through at all. So canopy in that sense can also have a little bit of a double meaning. But in general, of course, canopy these days is seen as something very positive, tree canopy. It helps us fight climate change, it helps us cool our cities, and companies like here, Davy Trees, they're really focusing on the canopy side of things. And now, being in North America for about 3 years, I realized, of course, we're building heavily on this shade tree tradition that we have. It's not urban forestry arboriculture started off as shade tree management. And that's not for nothing, of course. Cooling our cities, making our cities more livable has always been very important. But let's not forget that trees also have other meanings to people. So it's not only about shade, it's not only about cooling, it's not only about air pollution reduction. There's this whole breadth of benefits and functions and cultural meanings and spiritual meanings that also are important in urban forestry. So let me take you to the first case study. And that's my current home city of Vancouver, British Columbia. A wonderful city, a green city, at least green, surrounded by very nice green areas. And also a city with a very big ambition. So the past mayor, Gregor Robertson, he expressed the wish to be to make Vancouver in the world's greenest city by 2020, which is next year, right? So it's pretty soon. But Vancouver also has challenges, as many of you know. It has a very booming real estate market, meaning that for me, having to buy a house in Vancouver, I would have to dish up about £2 million, which of course is not very affordable for a university professor, let it be for most average Vancouverites. And that has to do with a lot of the investment coming from especially Asia and currently again Hong Kong as well. As I said, we live in volatile times, so people come and invest money in other places where it's still safe. So people buy up property and that drives up prices. And when property, of course, gets attractive, people start looking for more land for property. And what happened in Vancouver is that on a lot of the private properties, bigger properties, but also bigger duplex houses, we call them, are being built. And a new zoning accepted by the city of Vancouver recently actually allows you to turn over your single residence into a duplex, a double residence. And you can already, as street people, of course, imagine what this is going to mean. It means less private trees. So our canopy cover has been dropping. In the world's greenest city, we've actually gone down from about 22% to about 18% canopy cover. And Vancouver is trying to fight that. They put in a new tree ordinance, which is more strict. It makes it more difficult to remove private trees or trees on private property. It also is planting trees, about 150,000. And here the canopy thing comes in. So canopy targets have become so important that the city is basically trying to put in trees wherever they can. And one of the prime destinations to do that these days is golf courses. And of course, from some perspectives, that's great. Trees on golf courses have their role to play, but maybe from a, let's say, public health benefit or other types of benefits, it's maybe not the optimal way of going forward. So it shows canopy targets are good, maybe to show the urgency of canopy laws and to show we have to do something. It also helps drive forward urban forestry programs, but it can easily become a focus on quantity rather than quality. This is the thing about the tree ordinance that has been developed. Another study we've been doing, we work a lot with Vancouver, we also work with other Canadian cities, and one of the cities that we have been looking at is the town of Oakville in the Greater Toronto area. And for those of you who know Canada and who know Canadian urban forestry a little bit, I know at least another Canadian in the room here, you know that Oakville is kind of the quintessential urban forestry city in Canada. That's really where a lot of the current urban forestry policy developed. And not in the least, that was because of their local champion, John McNeil, an excellent urban forester, who drove forward a very aggressive urban forestry program in a community that was pretty well off, pretty affluent, and where there was also a mayor who was really interested in trees and keeping the city green. And the mayor was also pursuing very hard, very ambitious canopy targets. Even to the extent that some of the people in Oakville started thinking that this is maybe a bit too much driven on numbers. And they put up this special website called Plant, where you can track the number of trees being planted in Oakville. And Oakville had all kinds of other challenges. They were dealing with emerald ash borer, they lost a lot of their canopy cover, they're dealing with heavy development, but still the mayor was pushing that canopy target. Make sure we keep growing all the time. And of course, again, that's on the one way very good, of course, that may be taking away some of the priorities or some of the focus on things that are really important. And having been in Canada 3 years, I think the most commonly asked question when people call me is from cities, they will ask me, Cecil, you've been working across the world, please give me a number. What should be the canopy target? Is it 30, is it 40, is it 25? And I never can give them an answer. And I'll get back to that because, of course, it's very difficult to specify one specific number. And to show the risk that are associated with that, I would like to introduce you to this case in Beijing, China, a small city with about 28 million people, right? Double the population of the Netherlands almost. So we've been doing some work there carefully because it's not always easy to work with the Chinese government, but I have some really great grad students who are working there and they're analyzing, evaluating Chinese or Beijing's current program to plant, and here it comes, 50 million trees. They call it the 1 million mu program, 666 square kilometers of new urban forest. And you would say, okay, great, how long is it going to take? 20, 30 years? No, this is actually being done already in 3 years' time. And they're going to do another 1 million mu, another 50 million trees over the next years. And this is really driven by hard canopy targets, hard green space targets. Beijing realizes it has to deal with things like pollution and dust storms. It has to make sure it keeps itself livable, being this mega city it is. It's also, of course, the political center of China, so there's a lot of focus on it. So there's a very aggressive tree planting campaign. That leads sometimes to social displacement. If you want to live in Beijing, you need to have an internal passport that says you're actually a Beijing resident. Many people from other parts of China come there and live there, what they call illegally. And during recent years, these quarters of these people, the residents, the residential districts where they have lived, they have been bulldozed over and trees are being planted on top of them. So urban forestry can be complex, and trees win, but sometimes they win at the expense of people, which could be a tricky one. So quantity and quality, once again. A story where I think canopy cover played out maybe better is Melbourne, and I think many of you are familiar with it. I'm sure that people have spoken about Melbourne at this conference. Under the leadership formerly of Ian Shears, the urban forestry program there was really successful in turning around the attitude towards trees in Melbourne, and also dealing with the issue of climate change and drought, and trying to think, okay, we have this declining canopy, we have to really start replacing our trees, make it more resilient, urban forest, and then we can actually start bringing our canopy cover back up. A simple narrative that appealed to the politicians and also to the people of Melbourne. So sometimes simple stories, of course, can help you turn around a negative narrative. This is work done by Kieran Doig and others, and I'm pretty sure, I think later we'll hear more about this, but this shows you just a little bit of the canopy targets of some of the familiar cities in the world. Ambitions from Melbourne going from 22 to about 40%, Toronto from 20 to 30, 40%, but also Barcelona trying to raise its canopy cover with about 5%. And Barcelona, of course, being the very dense city it is, puts itself up to a very realistic challenge. And then again, you can ask yourself the question, this 5% and the investment it will take, is this actually a good investment? Or should we rather maybe look at what we have right now and develop that in a good way? And this is all over the place. So this is a story from a French newspaper. I don't expect you to understand what it says really, but this shows you that cities are really starting to compete on canopy cover targets as well. This is actually not canopy target. This is the MIT Google Street View type green index, and I'll get back to that later. And it shows you that cities really are looking at each other, says, okay, what's Melbourne doing, what's Amsterdam doing, what's London doing, and they start relating to that and maybe planting trees to be part of the game. This is Canada, and here you see some canopy targets for Canada, Canadian cities, done on a pretty stringent methodology. And the interesting thing here is that you see that the official figures that cities will give you can be quite different from the objective assessments of canopy cover. So for example, Oakville here, the city I talked about earlier, the estimate by the authors here says that we have a 23% canopy cover, while the local municipal estimate is still at 29%. This could be a lag in the data, this could be all kinds of reasons why the municipality has the wrong figure. But interesting enough, you see the town of Halifax in Nova Scotia on the east coast, it actually has a much higher canopy cover than it states in its official documents. So canopy cover is still a bit tricky in that sense, and although we're getting better measurements and better methods, and we'll hear much about that later, you still see that different kind of figures are circulating in political documents, for example. So I'm not the first one to speak critical of canopy cover goals. My good colleague Philip van Wassenaar, he's in the audience here, and his co-worker Andy Kenny, an icon of urban forestry in Canada, they wrote this paper a few years ago, and they stated that we have to be very careful working with canopy targets as a driver of policies and urban forest management. It's a two-dimensional perspective. And they highlight especially, and I think it's a really good point, they highlight especially the issue of stewardship. They say, well, don't we maybe, if we just state a canopy target, take away a lot of the focus from the fact that urban forestry should be something which is actually done by the community as a whole. And we're thinking about things like governance, where there's all kind of ways how we try to develop our urban forest. So we involve maybe citizen groups, NGOs, private sector, and maybe a canopy target can sometimes help, but it's not always very helpful in that sense to build up that community stewardship perspective. So I told you that I often get the call when people ask me, Cecil, what would you set as a canopy target? And I never give an answer because I know I'll be cited on that, and before I know it, I'm known as Mr. 25%, right? So, and it's not 25%, obviously. So I have to be careful with that. But American Forest, for many, many years, a well-known American NGO, very influential in North American urban forestry, they had a very clear canopy target. Anybody knows it? 40%. 40%. Then recently, this happened. The new urban forestry director for American Forest came out and said, we step away from it. We don't advise 40% anymore because simply there's no research to support this. Interesting, right? Because that actually shows that we're getting away from the kind of one canopy target fits all perspective. And it makes a lot of sense, as you'll see in the rest of my presentation. So looking at the literature and looking at what people have been publishing, there's quite a lot of things being published right there on canopy targets. But the focus is really on three main research topics so far. There's a lot of work on canopy cover estimation, like what kind of methods can we use to have an accurate assessment of our canopy targets, or canopy cover. Then there's a lot of focus, not surprisingly, on what we call regulatory ecosystem services, things like cooling and air pollution reduction. And then the third one, and that's maybe a bit, the old one now, a bit interesting, is work on canopy cover and environmental justice. So how does canopy cover that differs over a city relate to people's socioeconomic status, for example? A lot of work done in North America on that, showing over and over again that areas with lowest canopy cover are also typically the areas with the highest social deprivation. So quite a lot of work being done also in my university. But there's also some work more on general health, there's a little bit of governance work, stewardship, etc. So quite some literature coming out. Based on that, and based on some of the work we've been doing at UBC, there's a few things that you can say about the good points of canopy cover. And you will hear about this, I think, over the next 3 days as well. It's a simple and powerful narrative. Everybody gets it, even politicians. It's very simple. So it's very say, okay, we have 20% canopy cover today and we want to double that, 40%. And you'll hear that story quite often. We want to double our canopy cover. It's easy to communicate and understand, to some extent at least. It provides a common narrative, and that can be needed sometimes in this muddy and complex urban forest governance and management context. It's a measurable indicator, as the work of Kieran Doig and others also shows. It's something that you can actually start benchmarking between different cities, and you can start comparing yourself and say, hey, we're in a similar climate zone as London, how should we have a similar kind of canopy target? You can use canopy targets to some extent to generate public support, at least maybe business support. People can relate to that narrative. It also highlights the urgency of loss. In a time where we're faced with pests and diseases like emerald ash borer in North America, we really want to have some focus on that, to say, hey, we're actually losing percentage of our canopy cover. And Vancouver was a good example of that through mostly development. It's also, of course, linked to these ecosystem services. So some of our ecosystem services like cooling and air pollution reduction, and so we can directly link to canopy cover. Others we can absolutely not. Spirituality, cultural meaning, etc. is very difficult to relate, even some of our health benefits. And then as said already, it also allows for benchmarking. So just to show you a few of those very good ways that the canopy cover has been used. New York City, of course, very famous with its 1 million trees NYC project, really focusing on getting up the numbers, the quantity of trees. And those of you who visited New York City also know there's something to be said in favor of that, but also against it, because not all of those trees that have been planted, of course, are looking that great. And then came a new parks commissioner, Mitchell Silver, who came with a very different background. He's an urban planner. And he said, great with these canopy targets and great with all these new trees, but I want to make sure that we plant the trees and new parks in the right areas. I want to have a social justice perspective. So I'm looking at the areas where people in New York are under-catered for in terms of green spaces. So he changed the narrative from just a pure canopy cover increase to a very targeted increase in certain areas with a social justice agenda. Cities across Canada, across the world are using canopy targets. This is a very small city called New Westminster in British Columbia, in the Greater Vancouver region, former capital of British Columbia. And you see again the very familiar graphics here of declining canopy cover and this magic spike up. We're changing around. We're going to change the narrative of urban forestry. Or Beijing, where there's a very complex governance situation. So you would say, okay, in Peking and Beijing and in China, it's pretty easy. You have the government, it's top down, they decide what to do. But my student, Na Yao, he actually showed that there's a lot of different government actors and a lot of infighting within the Chinese government system. There's the Forestry Bureau, there's the Gardening Bureau, there's the civil engineers, there's a lot of political interests. So there's a very complex governance situation. So those canopy targets are actually helping to provide some clarity and some collaboration in that difficult situation. And we need some kind of indication of how we want to move governance of urban forests forward. This is my grad student, Zach Wirtz, who defended his master thesis last week. And he did a survey, a Delphi survey, on identifying success factors for governance of urban forests. And what people in his survey, these were Canadian urban forestry professionals, what they really highlighted quite a lot apart from finances, was that we need to have some clear objectives, some clear targets. We need to have a good vision. Otherwise, urban forestry is not going to be very successful. So people want that clarity. And especially, as I said earlier, in time of volatile change, and everything seemed to be up for change these days. So this is again citing the work of Kieran Doig and colleagues about some of the good things that citywide tree canopy can provide us with. Current methodologies and technology actually allow us to be more precise, and we can actually start doing comparisons across cities. Maybe not so much relying on the city itself to provide its canopy targets or canopy assessments, but having some kind of unified approach. And then loss. Some of you may have seen the movie Blade Runner 2049, the single tree surviving, kind of the main character in the whole movie, I would argue, more than Ryan Gosling or Harrison Ford, but that can be argued, I guess. But it shows, of course, that we have this tendency that we want to show people that, no, it's not going well, we're losing trees. And losing trees can be because of, for example, pests and diseases like emerald ash borer. We have these calamities. Things are happening every single day today. They're actually threatening our urban forest on a catastrophic scale. Japan just been hit by terrible weather. We've seen the Bahamas, of course. We've seen what's happening in North America in general. So we're losing urban forest cover not only on the longer term, but also to this what we call pulse events that can really be very detrimental. And here, of course, canopy is a good indicator. So, hey, we lost, due to the storm, 20% of our canopy cover. People can relate to that. And then these ecosystem services like shading and cooling, of course, in today's times of climate change, this is a very powerful narrative. This is a worker in Dubai recovering from working outside in 45, 50 degrees centigrade temperatures. Prognosis shows that many cities in the Middle East will have this 50 plus centigrade temperatures during large parts of their summer, which means for our basic human physiology, we can't be outside very long. So we have to go into air-conditioned spaces. So unless we do something with it, we try to cool our cities down, this is going to be really a major factor even in maybe even relocating some of our cities because we simply can't be in certain climate zones anymore. And of course we all know iTree's benefits and what it has done also in the UK. And of course here canopy cover is a very, very good method because it really relates to many of those benefits that iTree captures very well. So again, powerful and very strong reasons for using canopy targets. Benchmarking, this is some work FAO did a while ago, I contributed a little bit to. Cities across the world want to compare themselves with each other. And greening has become one of those narratives that cities use to be successful and to compete with each other. Some of you may know there's this new program, 3 Cities of the World, that was launched by Arbor Day Foundation and ISA and others. And this is really to try to raise the bar in terms of urban forestry and arboriculture across the world. And I'm really happy that organizations like AA and so they're also supporting this because it really gives new ways of benchmarking and bringing cities together to share knowledge and experiences on a slightly competitive scale, right? Because they want to compare themselves, and canopy cover is one way to do that. Just to show you that we have to be careful with these hard figures, hard norms. Some of you may have seen this one, the WHO standard of 9 square meters of green space per inhabitant, per capita. Anybody heard about it? It's cited all over the place. And there has been quite a bit of debate on it on the internet because this is just a fluke. It's not an actual standard. FAO has, or WHO has never published anything along these lines. So it's complete nonsense. It was written somewhere in a document, somebody picked up something wrong, and then it has been living its own life. And people cite it all over the place, especially politicians. You'll notice that, yeah, we have 9 square meters, so we should be pretty good. So we have to be really careful with some of those numbers that we assume are a fact, a truth, right? So we have to be really careful as we move forward. And that will be the same with canopy targets in general. Speaking of which, pitfalls. And here comes the critical perspective in terms of how we work with canopy targets. Of course, cities and local conditions are extremely different. If you're in Phoenix, Arizona, or you're in Halifax, Nova Scotia, or you are in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, West Africa, the situation will be completely different. Some cities are built literally into a forest, so no big deal of having a big forest cover. Think Atlanta, Georgia, which still has a very high canopy cover. And also, of course, the climate allows for fast growth. Vancouver is based in a rainforest, temperate rainforest. So trees have no problem growing. That we're actually at 20% canopy cover is a little bit of a disgrace, to be honest, because we should be much higher. So we have to compare. We also have to think about other ecosystem services. Canopy cover has nothing to do really with cultural benefits. It has nothing to do with some of the social benefits that people get. So we have to have a much more nuanced approach to our urban forestry governance targets. Of course, public-private. You can have a very high canopy cover, but it could be all on private land. It could all be privately owned, and then some of the benefits are not to be begotten by part of your population. It's two-dimensional in the words of Kenny and Van Wassenaar and others. How about your on-the-ground experience? I mean, we're not, as far as I know, we're not birds, right? We're not flying over the urban forest and seeing how it looks. We're on the ground, we're looking around, and we get the experience from the ground. So how do we measure that? And I'll show you how that's done these days. It focuses on quantity over quality, which is a concern. If you think about resiliency, you think about tree species, you think about things like how do we integrate native species and natural processes in our urban forest. Canopy covers are not always the best way forward. It's not only about trees. The urban forest is about trees, of course. It's about people, but it's also about all types of other vegetation that works in to provide all the green space benefits. The uneven distribution of canopy, although that could also be seen as something that canopy cover can highlight. And finally, of course, methodology will have to be standardized. So one of the gurus of canopy cover and benefit assessments in urban forestry in the world, I would argue, Greg McPherson, who retired a few years ago, he already started making that point clear to American forests. And he was probably one of the people who made them drop that 40% norm. And he says, we really have to see that cities are in different phases of their development, different climate zones. They have different kind of legal and policy set up, as well as different land use patterns even within the city. So of course when you have an urban forest, it's not all the same, right? You go from the center, downtown core, where you have your street trees and maybe your square trees, to areas where you have maybe larger forest on the rim. You would have residential areas where there could be a lot of trees. So we have to work much more with this kind of typology and continuum of land uses in the city when we work with canopy. So people always, in my opinion, especially lay people, when they hear canopy targets, they have this idea of kind of a uniform city where trees are spread out nicely and evenly. And that's a very dangerous narrative, because we know, of course, that's not the reality of our cities and how they are shaped. So just to give you 3 different examples, this is Prince George, British Columbia, a forest town built into the forest. Canopy cover here is not an issue. You can go up to 60, 70, 80% maybe in some cases. Very different from Hong Kong. How do you try to bring up a canopy cover here? Well, Hong Kong has a very decent canopy cover, but not really within its built areas. It's in the county parks that are protected for drinking water, etc. Or if you go to a city like Guayaquil, Ecuador, canopy targets will be an even different cup of tea, to say. So we have to take that perspective into account as we move forward. We did some work with Lara Roman and others describing something which we call urban forest legacies. Describing the unique history that cities have in shaping their urban forest over time. The cultural histories, the different types of actors that are involved, the biological histories, and they all play in to bring forward a unique situation for urban forests, which can mean the difference really of being able to have a 30% or maybe only a 10% canopy cover, or maybe in some cases a 60 or 70%. So you have to dig into those legacies and understand where we come from before you start making any predictions or any ambitions of how you want to raise your canopy cover. And of course, over our history, we have, as humans, interacted with trees in many, many different ways. It's a fantastic graphic. It was actually a summary of a scientific article by Joseph Townsend and Susan Barton that kind of summarizes their perspective on the psychological importance of trees over time, really showing that human beings are closely connected to trees. And canopy targets tell only part of that story. It could be one single tree that is important to us, one unique specimen. And that tree will mean much more to us individually than any canopy target would in other ways. And there's this kind of a fine balance. This is Emily Rugel, who did her PhD study at UBC, finished about a year ago. And she was looking into developing a new green index, a greenness index, where she tried to bring in different types of benefits, recreation, health, and compare that then to the greenness of different areas. And one of the things she found is that we're always focusing on kind of the iconic, the bigger green spaces in the city, the big parks, and people have access to that. But it turned out in her work that the visible green, the green you see directly from your residence, that has a much more important impact on our mental health and well-being. So when we start taking away trees from our direct living environment or our school environment, then you see mental health problems go up. And she did a pretty thorough study on that. So our canopy targets capturing that, the kind of visible green that we have directly outside of our window or out on our porch or out in our street, out in our schools, out in our workplace. Are we really capturing some of those really important nearness factors in green space with canopy targets? So I mentioned already that some people are now looking at this kind of street experience of green spaces. MIT has done this really interesting work on the Green View Index, where they compare cities across the world, and basically they give a 360 degrees perspective while you're walking down the street of how much green do you see around you. And of course that figure is very important because it shows you, for example, that in Vancouver on average you have a 27% green view. So it shows all the way around you, 27% of your view will be green. And that's pretty cool information, because you can actually start relating different parts of the city if you experience green or not. For example, if you have a lot of green space that is private, maybe in courtyards, you won't experience that on the street level. So it really adds very nicely to that more two-dimensional canopy perspective. And smart urban forestry is a new thing. I can imagine a few years down the road, AA is going to organize a conference on that, because it's a hot topic. We just published a paper on that. Because urban forestry, we have to admit, we're not really high-tech, right? But we're getting there. We're starting to do all kinds of interesting stuff. Drones and QR codes and the Internet of Things. Some of you have heard it. That's one of those hot topics today. Google it. The Internet of Things. So we can have real-life information on, for example, how our trees are growing, how they're taking up nutrients, how people are perceiving them, how people are moving around our parks. There's a lot of interesting things going on. Some of it is a little bit tricky, a little bit dangerous. Again, China is doing a lot of that, for example, in terms of face recognition and monitoring people in their parks. The data restrictions there are a little bit less than we have here. So, but it shows you there's some interesting perspectives in terms of how much live information we can get into our urban forestry. Rather than having to go out every second or third or fifth or 10 years and do an on-the-ground tree inventory, all of a sudden we can start doing things to Google Street View, where you even now can start assessing DBH and things like that. So there are some really good technological advances that will make our life easier over time. So that's the good news for sure. And in Beijing, I told you already this thing about the number game there. It's all about putting in the number of trees, and this is kind of the typical urban forest you will find in Beijing. This is really built on one of those social housing areas before. People were moved out, thousands of people, and now all of a sudden it looks like this. But also in Beijing, people start realizing this is maybe not a forest. So they start thinking about maybe making it more biodiverse and trying to mix with some new perspectives on ecology and mixing species and trying to use native vegetation. So this is a small forest park called the Guangyanggu Forest Park, close to the Tiananmen Square in central Beijing. And this is a 2-hectare area where the government is experimenting with this more naturalistic approach to greening. I took a group of Chinese students there. We had a summer course. We tried to see, okay, how is this working? And there's pros and cons again. But it shows you that the number game is no longer just a number game. It's also about creating quality over quantity in some cases. And we need that because, of course, the iconic kind of street tree views that we know from places like Vancouver could be like this, and people love it. But, of course, we know, as people with an ecological mindset, a pest and diseases mindset, this is kind of a call for disaster. Because we know we have the same species, same genetic material, people love it, but before you know it, pest hits or disease hits and it's gone. So we have to think more about diversifying and trying to get people adapted to the idea that street trees will not maybe look so symmetric all the time. And then to think more about resilience, about building that system that can actually recover, bounce back after all these events that we're going to experience over the next years. So another student of mine, Jahan Samaha, who also defended recently, she was really interested in the question, who decides what trees to plant in a city? And it seems to be pretty straightforward, but it turns out, and this is a North American study, there's a lot of different people. There's urban foresters, there's arborists, there's landscape architects, there's horticulturalists, there's ecologists. And it turns out that many of those people agree on some of the main factors, like what makes a tree a good urban tree, street tree. Tolerance scores high among all the groups. But then there's other things like ecosystem services, etc. But the scary part is, if you look at the preferred species palette, the species mix that these different professions want to use, is very different. So urban forest and arborists, they kind of agree on what species are good, what species are bad. But they completely disagree with the ecologists and the horticulturalists in many cases. So as more and more different professions are coming in and making those decisions, it may be time for us to start communicating about why we prefer trees and we don't like other trees. This was a survey based on about 800 experts of urban forestry in North America, and some of the findings were pretty shocking to us to see that there was such a spread. A tree like calorie pear, that many of the urban foresters in North America are not very fond of, was actually preferred by some of the other professions. So how do you get over those gaps in knowledge and those misunderstandings sometimes of what a good street tree is? Or maybe people are just selecting based on different criteria and factors. So it's not only about the trees. This is work again in China by a famous landscape architect called Konijnenijk, who's doing a lot of climate adaptation work. He has invented this idea of the sponge city, which the Chinese love. So you make a city green and it absorbs the excess water that you get during climate change. But of course it's not only trees, it's marshes, it's wetlands, it's green roofs. So canopy targets don't really cover that. They don't cover your area of green roof. They don't cover the way wetlands are integrated in your city. They don't cover blue spaces. So they should all, canopy assessments should always go hand in hand with the assessments of some of those other parts of your ecological green infrastructure. Not in the least also because I'm sure many of you have become familiar with this word, but this is kind of the flavor of the month, I was going to say, but it has been around for a bit now in the European Union, nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions, what's that? Well, that's how nature helps us to address some of the challenges we face in our cities and towns. Great. Nature-based solutions, you will think, okay, trees, great, excellent. Finally, we have a way of bringing trees onto the political agenda of cities and the EU. The reality, of course, it's a lot of high-tech stuff. So it's green walls, green roofs, it's maybe rain gardens to some extent. And you see a lot of other professions coming in, the engineers and a lot of high-tech people coming in and claiming part of that pie of research funding that's coming in. So once again, we have to be careful that we don't miss out while we focus on our canopy targets and we focus on managing our urban forest and other people are going away and doing all this exciting nature-based solution stuff. So again, we have to be aware and we have to be careful that we make that story a bit more nuanced and a bit more complex. And finally, canopy cover can sometimes give you a very wrong idea of how benefits are delivered on the ground to different parts of your population. So a lot of work in North America is looking at that, trying to see, okay, relate different canopy cover targets also to the local situation in terms of socioeconomic status of the people. Famous work done by Nick Heinen and others in Milwaukee showed that, for example, areas where there was a very high share of African Americans, they typically had the lowest canopy cover in the city. Tanley Conway and colleagues in Canada have done an interesting study as well that showed that areas where you have the highest community stewardship, so also usually the areas where you have the highest income levels, that's the areas where you get most tree planting and higher tree canopy. And that's of course a little bit of a contradictory issue because all of a sudden we have people that are affluent, that have the means, that already have a lot of green space, often private gardens, and they're making their part of the city more green, while other parts of the city where you don't have that capacity actually are not as green or maybe even losing canopy cover. We see that in Vancouver very much. So on the west of Vancouver, the city is very green, very affluent. You move east, you see the canopy cover drop, you see socioeconomic status go down. Till all the way when you're downtown east side, Vancouver, you feel you're like in a third world country. People are living on the streets in the thousands. A lot of addiction problems, a lot of mental health problems, hardly any tree inside. So these are serious issues. And canopy targets, I think, will bring us forward to dealing with some of it, but we have to definitely broaden that perspective. So I would argue that canopy targets have their value, and I think you've seen that I'm critical, but not that critical, say we have to drop them completely. We have to just use them in much more sophisticated ways. And I'm pretty sure that we'll hear more during the coming days that shows us how to do that. How to use that more nuanced ways of assessing, to look at the city in terms of its different types of land use, its different type of socioeconomic regions, to look at different canopy targets across the city, and also to think, okay, what is realistic from our city's urban forest legacy, the heritage we have? What is a realistic way of working with canopy targets? Do we have enough trees? Do we want to move forward? And if so, what is fitting for our local situation? There are more opportunities, and definitely technology and technological advancements are going very, very fast. Things like AI, artificial intelligence, smart city technology, GIS, remote sensing, LiDAR, they have given us the tools over the last 5 to 10 years that we would never have thought we would have today. So it's really going to make a big, big change in urban forestry. But on the other hand, we're also getting some really interesting insights in how trees interact with each other. Some of you will know the work of Professor Suzanne Simard at UBC, who inspired the famous book, How Trees Communicate, Trees Talk with Each Other. Or The Secret Life of Trees, right? So it shows that trees communicate and they exchange nutrients and they warn each other. So what do we do in our cities? We plant our trees in lonely boxes so there's no way they can communicate with their peers. So I think also from an ecological perspective, we'll see some major changes in how we're looking at street tree populations, for example, over the next years. So keep that in mind as well as we look at this big picture technology, GIS assessments and so. It's also about that single tree and how that single tree relates to the wider urban forest. What does a specific canopy target really represent? What does it mean for our city? What is the story behind it? Who came up with it? Was it just that single politician who just picked up a magic number from the internet? Or was it a well-informed, well-debated target done in stewardship approaches involving the community that says this is realistic for our city. We want to work together to strive towards that objective. A big, big difference between those two, obviously. We want to link to the full set of ecosystem services and benefits, not just cooling or climate change. I know climate change is on everybody's minds, and it's a great segue for urban forestry. But we have to be careful that we keep that narrative much broader, and we realize that actually when it comes to the individual person, it's about those cultural, spiritual, personal, historical relations to trees. That's actually what builds the capacity and builds the support for urban forestry. And I already mentioned again this thing of urban forest legacies, that wherever we are in the world, be it in Exeter, be it in Vancouver, be it in Indian cities, we'll hear a fantastic perspective from India later in this week, the situation is just so very different. And the urban forestry situation is so very different. So we have to be nuanced, we have to be understanding, we have to understand the complexity of it, and then Canopy targets can actually help us drive forward this fantastic agenda that we have. Thank you very much.
A fantastic presentation as ever from Cecil there. Next up is Annabel Buckland with a reflection on changing canopy cover trends in the UK. Over to Annabel.
Yeah, so as Tony mentioned, what I'll be going through today is my research on the historic urban canopy cover of Great Britain, looking at 10 case studies from all across Great Britain. So I'm an urban forest research scientist with Forest Research, and one of my main research focuses is canopy cover and the quantification of canopy cover. So I know we've been talking a lot about it this morning, but I think it's always worth starting the beginning with a definition. So what we are looking at in this presentation today as canopy cover is the layer of leaves, branches and stems of trees that cover the ground when viewed from above. So I'm talking about a bird's eye view of canopy cover rather than the volume that has been discussed in some of the presentations today. So, just a little overview of what I'll be going through today. I'm going to be looking at historic urban canopy cover assessments, particularly what they are and why they're so important. To do this, I'll explore a few previous studies from across the world and within Great Britain. We'll go through my approach towards historic urban canopy cover assessment, and then delve a little bit deeper into the 10 case studies that I have specifically looked at. Then we'll go with, what are we going to do next? What are we going to do with this information? And some concluding remarks. So, anecdotally, and in some of the presentations that have been this morning, we have seen decreasing urban canopy cover, both globally and within Great Britain. My research really aimed to test this theory using 10 case studies. Okay, so what are they? What are historic urban canopy cover assessments? It's a bit of a mouthful, but historic urban canopy cover assessments make use of historic information, in this case aerial imagery, to examine changes in canopy cover in urban areas over time. And this has a number of fantastic uses. So canopy cover is often recognised as becoming a baseline for urban forest managers to use in order to begin to improve and maintain the urban forest canopy, and therefore urban forests on the whole. They provide a long-term view to the urban forest, which is particularly important. We all know trees don't grow in a day. It's worth looking at them as a long-term view. So, the most logical place to start, previous research. What research has already taken place concerning historic canopy cover assessments? It's worth mentioning first off that this is by no means an exhaustive list. These are just some studies I picked out which I found particularly interesting. They had very comparable data to that which I had available, or they took place in Great Britain. So first of all, you'll notice here that only 3 of these studies took place in Great Britain. They are primarily from the United States. There's also some other sort of what I perceived as gaps in the literature, which is that often these canopy cover assessments only analysed a very short period of time, often 5 years or around that amount of time. So I did pick out some here which were much longer periods of time. An example of this was Sheffield. The Sheffield canopy cover assessment was particularly interesting. It covered 110 years of Sheffield's history from 1900s to 2010s. This also used particularly interesting data. Clearly, in the 1900s, there weren't aerial photography taking place. They actually used ground-based photography and paired it from the 1900s to the 1950s to the 2010s, which led to a massively long-term view of the urban forest in Sheffield. Sheffield actually saw decline from the 1900s to the 1950s, and then increase in canopy cover by 100% from the 1950s to the 2010s. Now, this is actually a very different story to the two other canopy cover assessments which have taken place in the UK. The one at the top, the low resolution historic canopy cover assessment of Great Britain, actually showed no statistically significant change from 2011 to 2016 across Great Britain. However, this was attributed to the low sample density across Great Britain. The results of this have been in the Arboricultural, which some of you might have seen. However, Wales Towns and Cities, which was a much more extensive study of all urban areas in Wales, showed that there actually has been a decrease from 2009 to 2013 in 72% of all areas in terms of canopy cover. Between 2006 and 2009, Wales showed an increase, but this goes back to some of the issues that have been discussed today concerning image resolution and the different numbers that can come out of this. It showed an increase, but this was put down to a better resolution of the data in 2009, which then showed a decrease coming on to 2013. So, after looking at some of the previous research and looking at the data that we had available, we chose 10 towns and cities in order to analyse the historic canopy cover change in Great Britain. This map shows the 1940s data which is available in black and white. So the 1940s data consists of some 1940 data, which is available just for Kent here, and then the rest of this data, all across the rest of Great Britain, is 1945 data. So primarily based on data availability, but also looking at a number of other factors, we chose these towns and cities. Some of the other factors were whether there has already been a present-day canopy cover assessment, as that would be very useful for us. And also trying to get a spread across Great Britain. We didn't want to lump all the cities together and get a very biased view of the changes that are going on. So in terms of the current canopy cover assessments that have taken place, this fed in quite strongly to the number of points that we chose to use for each city. The number of points has been discussed today in terms of iTree canopy work and the dot-based method, which is what we used here. So the number of points is based on the availability of data and the previous work that has been done. So for example, Edinburgh had a high number of points because some of Edinburgh wasn't covered in the 1945 data, so we had to mitigate with that with a higher number of points. And this slide here shows some of the importance of the points. This is Edinburgh here, and this is 2016 data behind it. So you can see here we have a random grid, or a random point layer overlaying the aerial imagery, which has all been gone through before, so I won't go through it too carefully now, but you effectively zoom in on each of these points and classify them as tree or not tree for this analysis, which, sorry? Which then you can turn into a percentage canopy cover estimation. But we're working with historic data. This has a couple of issues. So this is the data available for Maidstone. Maidstone actually had fantastic data availability. It had historic data from 1940, 1960, 1990, and then from all of the 2000s, which made it a joy to analyse, except when you zoom in on the 1940 data. As you can see here, so the town boundary is outlined in red, which is what we placed our points into. And then you can see here we have some missing data. In the case of Maidstone, this wasn't in the town boundary, but this was the case in some other cities. In this case, we discarded the points completely. We didn't analyse them for any of the years, otherwise it would change our results quite drastically. But that wasn't our only issue. You can also see here we had some areas of distortion where the image has been taken at a slight angle and then changed by Google Earth to fit into the flat area that it gives you. We also have some areas of cloud in about the same area, and you can see where all the photographs join together, which can be a little bit tricky if they're slightly off-center and your point is right in the middle of it. So that shows you some of the issues we had with the historic data, but we did come up with ways to overcome this. This is some of the other aerial imagery that we used. This is from BritainFromAbove.org, which is a fantastic resource if you're interested in historic aerial imagery. And Britain from Above has hundreds of thousands of photos across Great Britain, which show the landscape from above. But this is all taken pretty much from an oblique angle, rather than a bird's eye view as we were using from Google Earth. So for a little bit of comparison here, I've got the Google Earth imagery over here, which I've actually tilted, so it looks like it's taken from an oblique angle. And I've twisted it so that north is facing that way, which matches it up quite carefully with the Britain from Above area. As you can see, this little point is what I was trying to classify. It's not particularly clear under there whether that's a tree. There's a slightly darker patch which could be construed to be a tree, but I don't want to do it on just could be. But in the Britain from Above imagery, it's pretty clear that there is no tree there. So this really helped us when doing our analysis of the earlier data. I particularly wanted to include this slide. This is a storyboard of just a particular point in Birmingham. This is actually sort of just to the edge of a power station in Birmingham. And it gives you a great example of how it can change over time, and even a fairly short period of time from 1999 to 2018, rather than the full 78 years that we were studying in total. So you can see in 1999, we've got some bare soil or potentially freshly planted, pretty tricky to tell, which moves on to some scrubby area and a little bit more scrubby. And then by 2007, we have a little fully fledged patch of trees, which continues on through the years. And I just think this gives a really nice example of how some of the changes were shown over time. You can also see another issue that we had with winter imagery. If this image was a standalone one, you might not class this as trees. It's fairly difficult to tell if they're trees or bushes or shrubs. But with the combination of these images, you can usually tell, which made us confident on our data. So now we've been through the methodology of how we conducted this research. I'd like to go into some of the results that we've come up with. I know there's quite a lot to take in here, but I've split it up into regions for a little bit of easier reading. So we've got South East England up here, which includes Maidstone, Milton Keynes and Oxford. We've got Wales and West England over here, which is Cardiff, Swansea, Birmingham and Chester. We've got Scotland and North England over here, which is Edinburgh, Newcastle and Darlington. Okay, so I don't know about you, but to me, this all looks like a pretty happy picture. We've got quite a lot of upward trends over here. So out of the 10 cities that we studied, 7 of the cities did actually show increasing canopy cover, 4 of which were statistically significant. This included, go to my little stats book, this included Milton Keynes, Newcastle, Darlington and Chester. And that's fantastic. We have some statistically significant increase in canopy cover. amazing. Milton Keynes is a particularly great example. We have an increase from 16.2% to 29.4%, which is amazing. It puts it to about 12th in the UK in terms of canopy cover rankings. So fantastic. We did also see some not statistically significant changes, which included Oxford, Swansea and Edinburgh. But you still have an increase, you know. We saw a couple of little to no change, Cardiff and Birmingham. And we did see one urban area, which is Maidstone up here, which shows statistically significant decline. However, we are re-examining our Maidstone data as we've had some slightly spurious results from it. As you can see at the end here, we had a particularly low R value. So we're re-examining that, and the results of that will be out soon. So this gives the overall view of the 78 years that we analysed for all of the cities. But I do think it's worth zooming in a little bit to the last 20 years. So we've got the same regions here for easy reading, and this does show a bit of a different story. So we don't have quite as many urban areas showing increase, no urban areas showing significant increase. We have 3 showing little to no change, and 2 urban areas showing decline, which you can see up here, Birmingham declining fairly strongly, and where's the other one? Someone here. Well, Darlington's sort of on the way down. Yeah, so this is a little bit of a different story, and I think it is worth zooming in and creating these trend lines for these areas. But there is still some fantastic news here. For example, Milton Keynes, a planned city, is still going up very consistently. And this gives us confidence in our data. The values tend to be nicely, as we would expect along the line, as aligned with growth and things for the urban canopy. So now we have this information. What are we going to do with it? So historic canopy cover assessments are quite time-consuming. As I showed in a previous slide, the data for this sort of long-term assessment isn't present for all areas of the UK. So it's not possible to quite do that. But we did see in a number of the presentations this morning that there have been shorter-term historic canopy assessments taking place all over the world. And these are really interesting, and they can show us trends in our urban forest. But they say that, you know, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, the second best time is now. How about we start our historic urban canopy assessment today with today's urban canopy assessment, which will turn into a historic assessment in the future. So Forest Research have created a canopy cover web map, which has been previously mentioned. And this is aiming to map the urban canopy cover by percentage, by ward, for all urban areas in the UK. This is a citizen science project, and we've had a fantastic response. It's been up and running since January, and we've already completed 16% of the urban areas of the UK. Which doesn't sound like a lot as such, but that is 700 volunteer hours put into this map in particular. We've had some incredible areas such as Cambridgeshire, which the whole of Cambridgeshire has now been mapped. Manchester was mapped as part of the City of Trees programme, and Birmingham has been fully mapped. This is a little zoom in to give you an idea of the task that we're undertaking here, or that citizen scientists are undertaking. On this map, London, of course, you can see we have the green wards, which have been completed. So the lighter green is less canopy cover. So you can see down here the key coming from like 0%, 0 to 5, 5 to 10. And the very dark green wards are the very high canopy cover, above 30%. The yellow wards are those which have been assigned to citizen scientists. They assign themselves, we don't just hand them out. and they will be completing those in the near future. So all the information comes into us and we upload it onto the map for everyone to see. And some people get very, very into this and send a lot, and it's fantastic. And yeah, so if anyone would like to give this a go, which I encourage you strongly all to, you can follow this web link here, or I have flyers at the end if you're interested, as it's a fantastic project to get involved with. Okay, so just to wrap up a little bit, what I've gone through, the historic canopy cover assessment of the UK, we really like to see it as a baseline for improving canopy cover assessments across Great Britain and further afield. Historic canopy cover gives the long-term view of the urban forest that is so important, the long-term dynamics and beginning to delve deeper into the drivers of change. The results that we've come up with from this research do show a pretty happy picture of 4 urban areas having statistically significant increase, over from the 1940s to 2018, and only 1 area of statistically significant decline. From 1999 to 2018, we do have 5 areas of increase in canopy cover and 2 areas of decline. But really, the next step of all of this is expanding this research and beginning to map canopy cover, both historic and present, for across Great Britain more fully. Thank you. I think I've underrun a little bit, but more time for questions.
And the final presentation in this Tree of the Best is from Paul Barber in Australia, who's giving us some ideas about innovative techniques that can be used in measuring tree canopy cover in urban areas.
Great, excellent. Thanks very much, Tony, for the kind introduction. It's great to be here again. I've been to a couple of these conferences over the years, Warwick and also Exeter. I love coming back to this conference. Everyone really engages. It's a great feel. It's very friendly. And England's sort of like my second home. I first came to England in 1994. Came over here to play cricket. Sorry to mention cricket. But during that time, I met my wife, and I've come back many times since then. One of the reasons why I mention cricket is because of this image that you see up here. So this is the actual Sydney Cricket Ground. So this is an airborne image of the Sydney Cricket Ground from about 10,000 feet using the Arbicam. The Arbicam system is a sort of 11-band sensor system designed mainly to measure urban forests, but we measure a lot of other tree condition and cover in other areas. But you can see here the variation in condition of the turf, and we're actually using a lot for trees as well. And I'll talk about that today. And Cecil's talk was a great segue into what I'm about to talk about today. Okay, a bit of context. So I don't want to just get up here and talk about technology and measuring urban forest canopy and condition. I really want to talk about the health of urban forests, which is really important. That's been mentioned as well today. So my background is as a forest pathologist. My kids are now a lot older, but when they were younger and they were asked, what does Dad do? They found it really hard to explain what Dad does. It's a bit of an unusual job. But Dad's pretty much a tree hugger. That was the easiest way to explain for them. And this is a picture of me in Iran, actually in the Caspian forest, hugging a beautiful big oak tree. So there's amazing forests in Iran. So after I came to the UK to play cricket, I worked in a lab in Leeds part-time, sampling people's underarms and plating out the bacteria for this body odour experiment. And I decided then that I didn't want to be a microbiologist. I wanted to be something else. I wanted to work outside. So I went back and I studied, and I worked on leaf-infecting fungi on eucalypts, and that was some of the early work on the cut foliage industry. And then I did a lot of work in plantations, and then actually moved across from Melbourne to the other side of Australia, only about a 4 or 5 hour flight, to Perth, where I'm based now and have been for about 15 years, and worked on this complex decline of this amazing tree that we have in Western Australia. So this is the chewit, Eucalyptus gomphocephala, found only in that part of the world, endemic to that region. Grows on high pH soils, but suffering a very severe decline. Less than 30% of the original extent remains. And that opened my eyes to many other fields outside forest pathology and fungi, really. So mycorrhizal fungi, soil bacteria, nutrition, the role of fire, hydrology, and also remote sensing. That was 15 years ago now, and I saw the power in remote sensing. Okay. So this is some of the work we did around about 2005. So quite old now, but we were using tools like Google Earth to engage particularly school children on the role of remote sensing to monitor forests. And so here you can see Perth. So this is on the west coast of southwest coast of Australia. We see this is what we call the Swan Coastal Plain. So this is the dune systems, very flat. And then you come into this scarp and then these laterite soils in the Jarrah forest, which is quite a famous Australian eucalypt tree. This is a time series data set derived from the Landsat satellite sensor. So it's a land monitor product, they call it, comes out of CSIRO. It's used to monitor spatial and temporal patterns of green space and the landscape. And so what you're seeing here is a 15-year image of change in condition of the vegetation and the landscape. And so between 1990 and 2005, prior to 1990, those white areas, that's vegetation that's been removed. So it's highly fragmented. So a highly fragmented landscape. Then you have these other areas that are grey pixels. So we're talking about 25 metre pixels. Here you see stable, relatively stable over that 15-year period. Then you have these orange and red areas. That's loss in condition of vegetation over a 15-year period. Okay, so what remains is in a poor state of health. And then we see these green and blue areas. So that's increase in condition. Now this is a very powerful tool for time series and spatial analysis derived from the satellite across the landscape. And so you see the city of Perth, and what you're really seeing here is the spread of the urban sprawl. Okay, this is the impact, a lot of it's urban development, and it's in a much worse state than what you see there. So this is the power of remote sensing. During that time, we were working in these forests, peri-urban, sometimes urban, woodlands. And then I started getting more and more inquiries around the urban forest. So, why are our trees dying in the urban space? What's causing that? How can we improve the health of those trees? That's when I really got engaged with urban forestry and arboriculture. That was about 10 years ago now. And what was really stark to see in Perth, and this is the same, all over Australia and in many parts of the world, and Cecil talked a bit about that, is the expansion of cities. So here you see what is typical to see in the Australian cities. So what used to be bushlands and beautiful, often quite threatened landscapes is now wall-to-wall houses. And the houses that exist take up most of the block, and that's probably a nice piece of synthetic turf just there. So wall-to-wall houses, no room for trees, black roofs, really a terrible space for, again, human health and engagement with the urban forest. Okay, and these areas are hotspots, and I'll show some of that work we've done. It's clear that the population in cities will grow to about 2.5 billion people by 2050. So this is happening all around the world. People are coming to cities, and you know that. This is really concerning. So the number of extreme weather events and temperatures in cities will grow. So today in Perth, we're having 32 degrees. That's 10 degrees above the average for this time of the year. 2 weeks ago, we broke the record for the hottest August day on record. Okay, it's only going to become more common and more frequent. Increasing trade will bring more pests and diseases to urban forests throughout the world. There's no doubt about that. Okay, and that's already happening, and we're seeing that in Australia with biosecurity outbreaks, and that's happening all over the world. And the livability of cities depends on green space and canopy, and we know that. Okay, so I'll talk a bit about remote sensing and how we use that. So here what you're seeing is a high-resolution airborne multispectral image from a manned aircraft. So this is 25 centimetre pixels from fairly high altitude, maybe about 7,000 feet. And this was back in 2010-11. We were doing this work on changing condition of trees in the urban space. So this was the very first area that we acquired, was this golf course, and we've been acquiring imagery over that golf course for every year since then. So we're seeing change in condition of trees and canopy cover as well. What we're really highlighting here is, over a 1 year period, the loss in condition of the vegetation is highlighted in red. So very clearly you can see there are areas that jump out quickly to us as forest pathologists and arborists and urban foresters to see there are areas where there's loss. It won't tell you why there's loss, but it will tell you where there's loss, and we need to address that if we can. So we pinpoint our resources towards these areas, and that can be pruning down the median strip beneath power lines, sudden death of a shrub, maybe from a pathogen. This is a basal pathogen coming into this tree. The loss of a branch, so borers in this branch, in this large tree. Removal of palm fronds, for example. The blue and green is increasing condition. That's what we want to see, but the red areas are the concerns for the urban forest manager. So what this does is it provides an accurate and consistent measure of annual change in vegetation health, and I'll talk more about that. Those words are very important. What has become very apparent to me in working in urban forests and the decline of trees in the urban forest is that the current approach, particularly where I live and cities where I go around the world, it's not sustainable. Okay, so there's a lot of talk around planting lots of trees, increasing canopy cover. So for example, this tree here, this is an Agonis flexuosa. That's an advanced specimen growing in the front verge, the outside of house. That's the 7th advanced specimen that's been planted in that space and died. Okay. At that time, we were asked to come and look at why that tree was dying. And in fact, it had 2 or 3 species of Phytophthora associated with the roots. They were overwatering it. The rootstock was poor from the nursery. It never had a chance. Okay, so we recommended, based on what we were finding in there, to change the species, okay, and change the source of those trees as well. So the nursery where they're getting those trees from. That's completely unsustainable. And you know yourselves how much energy and time and money goes into getting a tree to that stage. Here you see what we commonly see as well in nurseries, so really poor root systems. Okay, so we're seeing these trees that above ground in the nursery look quite good, quite healthy, but below ground it's a very different story. And this root system, this compromised root system that we see in this large eucalypt, goes right back to when it was grown in the tube. And the roots became lignified, and they then were potted on, and this tree continued to grow that way. So that's completely unsustainable. I'm really concerned about the number of pathogens through the urban forest, how we're managing those, how we're exacerbating the conditions that cause decline of trees that are suffering from these pathogens. So one of our students, Mohammed Kadir, who's just finished his PhD, he did some work on some of our sites where we were finding this decline of trees across one local government area, about 90 square kilometres. In that one local government area, 60 of the 79 sites had at least one Phytophthora species associated with them. These are urban sites, so these are bushlands, parks and natural areas. One site had 71 detections of 22 species of Phytophthora. So we're just discovering these species all the time. We don't know what a lot of them are doing. We know they're there, okay, but they're there and they're causing issues. And we're doing a lot more research around those. 5 sites had more than 15 Phytophthora species. And the conclusion in that is the diversity in the urban area is very high, particularly where we're looking. And that's a concern. And the reason why that's a concern is because if you have trees that have compromised root systems, you are overwatering, you do have infill over the base of trees, and you have high summer temperatures. It's all conducive to the spread and development of pathogens like Phytophthora. And armillaria as well. I see a lot of armillaria. So we've done some work around some of these more common Phytophthora species, and then the most common street tree hosts in that local government area. Because for the local government, it's nice to know that they have these pathogens, but really they want to know what they're doing and what to do about them. Okay, so we've been inoculating a lot of these trees and looking at how pathogenic these more common Phytophthora species are, and that work will be published soon. Okay, so several videos from drones. So these are our videos and images, a variety of platforms and a variety of sensors that we've got on board. There's a lot of talk around, CubeSats, drones, UAVs, hyperspectral, artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, big data, all the exciting, sexy buzzwords. Okay, you'll hear lots of them, but none of them are any good unless you're using them the right way. Okay, you can spend a lot of time and money on them. So what you're seeing here, this is a recent project that I'll talk about soon, which is using our large multi-rotor copter with a hyperspectral camera on board, monitoring the impact of dieback on the kauri trees in the North New Zealand, in Northland. This is a large ficus, large limb that failed in a university in Perth, and just showing the ability to use drones for aerial inspections. And that was a whole heap of images that were pulled together into a 3D model, and then the fly through of the 3D model. So there are places where drones can be used for urban forest management, crown assessments, and canopy assessments. But they have limited applications, particularly when we're talking about canopies of urban forests. Partly that's because they can't easily be scaled, and partly that's to do with regulation. And I'll talk about why we don't tend to use them a lot. There was a recent article in Bloomberg, the drone bubble bursts, wiping out startups and hammering VC firms. Lots of companies popped up with drones, a lot don't exist anymore, and there's been a lot of money thrown into them. Okay, so they have their place, but it needs to be carefully chosen, particularly in the urban forest. Okay, so some case studies using remote sensing. So here we have kauri dieback in New Zealand. So the kauri is the amazing Agathis australis. It's an incredible species. New Zealand's largest tree. Up in Northland they have these amazing trees in the Waipua forest. If you've ever been there, Tani Mahuta, which is Lord of the Forest, Te Matua Ngāti and the Four Sisters. These are incredible trees. So there's Te Matua. So that tree there they believe might be up to around 4,000 years old. And Tani Mahuta they believe may be around 1,250 to 2,500, they're not sure, but they're massive trees in these amazing forests. And if you have a chance, go and see them. They're pretty incredible. Go and see them now because they are threatened, and they're threatened by a very serious Phytophthora species that's moving through the forest. What's that doing, that species? So it's causing crown thinning of trees, these large trees, dieback and then eventual death. Okay, and these are really impressive forests. So we were asked to go over there and undertake some remote sensing. You can see some of the symptoms here, so the oozing of these large trees, basal lesions, and you can see what they're trying to do. So they have some great systems in place with hygiene, foot baths, education of the visitors to the area. So this area has around 200,000 tourists visit that area just to see those trees every year. It's really impressive. So we took over several of our platforms and sensors and we undertook some aerial assessment of 4 hectare zones covering some of these trees. You can see here the entrance, so there's the entrance into the boardwalk that goes into Tani Mahuta. So what you're seeing here is a true colour composite, so you're looking at around about 3 centimetre pixels over that, which is a nice true colour composite. Incredibly diverse forest. You see here a variation in condition using what we call the vegetation condition index, so the red being lowest condition through to blue being highest. We see a composite of several of the hyperspectral bands. So the hyperspectral sensor has about 125 narrow bands that we can utilise. Most of those are probably redundant, but there are quite a few that are very useful for measuring condition and also for measuring species classification, things like that. And what we've done is basically go in and delineate the kauri crowns of interest. So there are emergent crowns, there are ricas, smaller trees, and then we're able to extract the condition indices from those crowns and then benchmark them against each other within a site. So that provides us a baseline of condition of those trees, and particularly in sites like this, very difficult to assess, particularly from ground level. When we start talking about this technology in the urban forest, like I said, not really scalable, okay, the drone space. So we tend to use a manned aircraft from high altitude. And this is an example of data that we collected over an area called the city of Subiaco. So here you have the city of Subiaco, you have several of the streets, and what this is height classified cover of trees, but just clipped out for the street. So we have the whole local government area, but then we can start to compare streets with parks, with commercial areas, residential and so on, and extract the statistics. And that's very important for local governments when they want to start to determine where to plant trees or where to manage their trees, rather than just they have this measure of urban canopy cover across the local government area. And it's very important to be able to stratify into height classes. So 0 to 3 metres below canopy, we're calling 3 metres canopy, and then these areas above 3 metres we can stratify into height classes depending on what the local government wants to do. So there are many different ways to approach this. What's important about this is we've been monitoring and measuring the canopy cover in the city of Subiaco for several years, okay, a couple of years apart each time. And then a report came out using iTree that benchmarked Australia's local government canopy right across the country. So it was a really powerful report, and it engaged a lot of people about the importance of urban forests and canopy, and then looked at where local governments sat in relation to each other across Australia. And what it showed, this change over a 5-year period, some were increasing and some were decreasing using iTree. And this city of Subiaco here using iTree showed that it had gone backwards by about 5%. Unfortunately, we'd had the airborne measurements using the multispectral imagery, and we'd been able to show that in fact the canopy had stayed the same around that time. So what it highlighted really was that iTree is a really useful tool for highlighting, raising awareness of the importance of canopy and for benchmarking, but it has its limitations. So there was a paper published by Pamir et al. In 2016 which discussed those limitations. So iTree really is it's a model using random point sampling. And when you use models, random point sampling, it's as good as the imagery that goes in, and it has its limitations. So in this case, they showed that it was roughly up to around about 4% different to actual remote sensing measurements. And that's really important when you start to think about how much canopy cover changes in a local government area over time. Some of the local government areas we're working in, it's probably changing by less than 1% each year. So a 4 or 5% error rate is quite high. So it's important to take that into consideration. It's also very important that the data is used wisely in a useful way. So for example, the data we collect, it goes into these various strategies and management plans. So we've been engaged to provide the canopy cover and condition measurements for the City of Melbourne, for example, and the City of Sydney, and that's being fed into their urban forest strategies. And the great thing about Melbourne is that they're thinking not only around about cover, but they're thinking about the condition of their urban forests as well, and have KPIs that they've set. But how you measure health is really quite complex. So they're looking at using a more quantitative tool to do that, and that's the Arboricultural system from high altitude. We've been feeding this data into various management plans and actually writing some of the strategies and management plans as well. So the City of Canning is a local government area that has one of the lowest canopy covers in Western Australia. And what we did with that work was we started to model where they're likely to head and what the impact of development will be. So Perth faces the same issues that many cities do around the world. Blocks are being subdivided, the zones are being changed, and that's impacting canopy cover. What we were able to show was it wasn't the zoning in terms of how many dwellings you could put on the block. It was the fact that there was any development that the canopy would go backwards. Okay, so the way trees were being protected was really a really key issue. Okay, another example. So this is data coming out of the Arboricultural system over the City of Sydney. This is from 10,000 feet. So the challenges around a city like the City of Sydney is that it has an airport very close to the city. So we can't fly any lower than that. We need to be flying much higher altitude to allow air traffic control to let us in. But from that altitude, we're able to acquire data at sub 10 centimetre pixels in the RGB. We're able to get multispectral imagery sub 30 centimetres. We're able to height stratify vegetation cover as well. And depending on the requirements, different height classes. So here you see an example, a true colour composite, a false colour composite, which is utilising the near-infrared bands. We have the height stratified cover over the same area. So those zonings, as you see here, we have that variation in condition, so the condition index, clearly showing subtle variations in the reflectance using that index. And we're also acquiring this surface temperature data concurrently over the city, okay, which we can directly compare the surface temperatures and urban heat island effect with canopy cover and condition of trees. And this is of increasing importance to local governments. What we're really interested in is not just providing these pretty pictures, but it's the data that comes out of them. Okay, so it's this sort of data that is going directly into the management plans. What is the percentage of cover that they have in each of these height strata? Okay, what is the percentage of cover that they have in each height strata in every single suburb in the city? So where are their tall trees? Where do they need to be planting more? Changing the structural complexity of their urban forests, which is very important for corridors, for habitat, for example. Okay. And this is very important as well. So control charts. So developing a time series of data of canopy cover or condition and being able to develop trigger thresholds. So if a city breaches that threshold, they know they need to act. Or if they're breaching a threshold on the whole local government area, where are they breaching that threshold? Is it a particular suburb? Is it a land use zone that they're managing? So we start to drill down into that data. And that's very important for a manager to be able to use that data to manage their urban forest sustainably. Okay, another example. So this is the City of Melbourne. So height stratified cover of their urban forest. You can see the level of detail from high altitude and being able to stratify that into height classes and then delineate canopy, which again here is 3 metres above ground level. So that's the yellow line that you see. So this is very important, obviously, for having accurate measures to meet targets that Cecil spoke about and be able to allocate these resources to where they need to put them. What we did in this project, going beyond scope, is we also developed another class, which was rooftop vegetation. And for the City of Melbourne, that's a very important one because rooftop veg and green roofs enable them to increase canopy cover where they can't do it in other areas, where they might be limited in planting trees. Okay, so these zones are becoming very important. So quantifying that is a very useful tool, particularly for their team in-house that manages that program. And when we see their tree audit data from the ground, so we can utilise that tree audit data, and we do that, and I'll show you some of the other work. The other one that's very important is early detection of disease in trees, and this is going to become an increasingly important issue in urban forests around the world as pests and diseases move and climates change and insects start to have a greater impact and pathogens do. So this is a project we've undertaken in Hong Kong, and Cecil spoke about that before, Hong Kong. So we've done quite a bit of work over there. It's an amazing city, so I was over there about 4 weeks ago. Came out just in time before the airport was shut down. But here you see, again, an airborne image from a manned aircraft. So we're seeing a true colour composite in these incredible buildings and vegetation. Not easy to see in a standard image, just like a normal mapping image, red, green, blue. But when we start to utilise the near-infrared band and other bands and develop an index, we can very quickly pull out where that vegetation is. We can even scale it from higher to lower reflectance, which can give us an indication of the condition of the trees and the vegetation. This project was around early detection of disease. There's a particular disease in the larger trees in Hong Kong, Pholinus noxious or Pyrenema noxium, which causes brown root rot disease. Very, very common in the subtropics, not so common in our part of the world. But you see here that these, what they call the stone wall trees that grow in Hong Kong, these amazing ficus that grow on the stone walls and form this incredible canopy over the roads. If they get brown root rot disease in them, the roots start to fail, then obviously that can be catastrophic, and has been over the last 10 years. There have been fatalities associated with disease in trees here. So we're looking at an early detection of decline in crown vigour that might indicate the presence, which therefore will help mitigate risk. Okay, that's the whole program around using a remote sensing tool. And you can see here a classic example. I've sort of climbed down a slope of one of those trees, so sampled a lot of those trees, and then you can see classic fungal lesion moving up from the base, from the soil in the lateral roots. We went there, so I took my daughter over as my slave during the school holidays to help me out, and it was hot and she did really, really well. But yeah, we went over there about, I don't know, 2 weeks after the typhoon went through, Typhoon Mangkhut. Half a dozen of our trees that we were meant to sample didn't exist anymore. So they'd failed, and you can see an example of one here that failed at the top of the steps straight down through the shopping mall. And you can see there's amazing trees. So this is up in mid-levels. It was about 36 degrees that day, amazing trees growing over the playground. There were children in there were people doing Tai Chi. You know, these trees are super important in places like Hong Kong and will become increasingly important. For us as forest pathologists, we're particularly concerned about tree health, and as again as alluded to earlier, lots of planting in new trees, lots of targets setting, increasing canopy cover, but what about the health and condition of the trees that exist and the ones that are being planted? So here's an example of some work in, again with the City of Melbourne. So trying to get away from a more subjective ground-based approach, assessing trees, saying good, fair, bad, poor, excellent, trying to make it more objective, more quantified, and extracting condition measures of their elm trees through the local government areas. So here you see the classification of canopy and then a delineation of crowns, and then the combination of remote sensing and tree audit data to then pull out condition measures of every tree. And if we can do that on an annual basis, we can start to get that fluctuation on a per tree level, and then managers can respond quickly, okay? And at the same time, save costs by not deploying loads of people on the ground to collect these measures. And then you can see the condition classified, and this just goes in as another line item attribute in the tree audit database. Okay, this is the way remote sensing can be used. And then we can start to look at the parks. We can look at how each park compares in the condition of a species or other species. We can do that in streets, and we can do that anywhere really. It's just a matter of approaching it the right way. And there's particular controls around radiometric calibration and geometric calibration as well that are very, very important when you're starting to look at condition and not just canopy. Okay, extracting condition values. There's a lot of limitations around that. But one of the advantages is you're not just limited to the public area, you can go into the private area and extract condition data as well. Human health has been a really important focus for us, so teaming up with other groups who are undertaking research in the human health space. And I see that as particularly important because over the years, talking about trees and the importance of trees and the benefits of trees, when you talk about biodiversity and these things, people tend to switch off, sadly. If you start to talk about human health and money, then people get engaged. And that's what we tend to talk about, human health and money. And then as a result, trees benefit and biodiversity benefits as well. So several years ago, we teamed up with a group from the Telethon Institute for Children's Health, UWA, and the Place Group. We had the data for canopy cover across the Perth region. We were able to stratify height class of canopy, and this is a study in early childhood education centres, so childcare centres for adolescents. They had the data, so what they were doing was they were attaching accelerometers. So these were, kids loved them, they're like superhero belts, they got these accelerometers that they walked around. This measured their physical activity. Then they attached UV tags to the children, so measured exposure to UV, and we had the canopy cover data for the childcare centres and then the shade. And so that looked at the correlation between them, and as expected, less canopy, hotter temperatures, more exposure to UV, less physical activity. But you need the data to show that and emphasise the importance of trees in these areas. And that work's just been published in the International Journal of Public Health. So yeah, and what was very concerning about this study was 66% of children are not getting the nationally recommended activity needed for their growth and development. And that particularly related to trees, shrubs and edible gardens being important for active play. Okay, so it's a really concerning message, and it's happening not just in Australia but all around the world. This is some work I did back in 2014, so this is just some work that we did internally, looking at the relationship of surface temperatures from satellite data and across different areas of Perth, and we see here these different suburbs, and I live just south here of the river. Interesting to see that this hot area there, that was a turfed area, surprisingly, but it was a tip that was beneath the turfed area, so giving off heat and seen in the satellite image. This area here, so this is next to Murdoch Uni. Okay, anyone guess what that might be?
Student housing.
It's a good guess. It's actually a retirement village. Okay, so that's where our older people are going to retire. You can see how it's been developed. So water wall housing, black roofs, pavement, hardly any trees. And what's it showing up as? One of the hottest places in Perth in the satellite data. So it's not far off our airport, actually. That's really concerning. Okay, so we must get smarter how we develop these areas, and remote sensing is a useful tool for that, to highlight the importance of trees in these spaces. This is a comparison in Singapore. That's a retirement village in Singapore. Okay. I know trees grow faster in Singapore and they're more conducive, but they've got it, they get it, they're a bit smarter that way. All right, okay, so some take-home messages. The population within global cities will increase, there's no doubt about that, and there will be a lot more people moving to cities. The frequency of extreme weather events and temperatures in cities will increase. It's already happening, it's going to increase a lot more over time, and we've seen that last summer, of course, in the UK. We saw 47 degrees in Paris. I'd hate to be in Paris when it's 47 degrees. So yeah, that will become more common, and that's a concern. Remote sensing is a complementary tool for the precise measurement and management of urban canopy. It won't replace arborists and won't replace urban foresters, but it's a complementary tool, and it's a very powerful tool to be used in conjunction with. It's very important to get the right platforms and sensors for the task, okay? Not all technology is useful and good, okay? So it's really important to get that right and see that there's a track record, it's been used wisely previously. You simply can't manage an urban forest sustainably without accurate data. Okay, and it's all right to set targets, but you need the accurate data to ensure that those targets are being met properly. And there are ways to do that, and remote sensing is a tool. It's scalable and very quick. And finally, urban planners, landscape architects, urban foresters, arboriculturists, and even forest pathologists, we all have a great responsibility to ensure we're adopting the latest approaches, we're utilising them, and we're getting those accurate and repeated measures of data over time that can be used for management and setting and meeting KPIs. Okay, thanks very much for your attention today.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that Tree of the Best. There will be more of these coming up. Hopefully we're going to do one every week. Let's see if we can beat 300 views on YouTube of this one for next week, so we can see a trend of people being interested. If you're not, then we can just stop doing them. That's fine. I don't have to stand out here in a field by myself. I can plenty of other things I could be doing. But hopefully you are enjoying them. Hopefully you're staying safe. Take care of yourselves, and we will see you very soon. Bye-bye.